I'm going to talk today about 3 possible ways of defending risk inclination and other regarding choices. And more precisely, my question is, can it be permissible to choose the riskier of 2 options for another person, even if that option has lower expected utility? And what I'm going to do in the talk is first I will introduce the problem or the kind of cases that I'm interested in, and then I will turn to the 3 defenses that I think are possible of risk inclination. And I have to say, I've been working on this topic for quite some time now, and I'm still not sure what I should think or say about these cases. So what I'm presenting is kind of where I am at the moment in my thought process. Okay, so sometimes people take risks that put their life, their health, and their well-being in jeopardy. And they do that in order to escape a destitute situation. And sometimes they also take risks for other people. So they risk the life of other people, they risk other people's health and their well-being in order to help those people escape destitute situations. And just to give you 2 kind of examples that made me interested in those choice situations. So for example, we can think of refugees who with their children on risky journeys in order to give them a chance for a safe and prosperous future. So for example, they risk the life of their children when they cross the Mediterranean, and they even if there's a high chance that their asylum claims will be rejected and they will be sent back, and they do that because they wish to provide their children with a chance of a better life in the host country. Then another example that I was thinking of is that of citizens taking part in uprisings to topple autocratic regimes. So this example is obviously a bit more difficult because there are many different interests that might pull in opposite directions, but maybe we can assume that the population at large has kind of the same utility function over the possible outcomes of the uprising. And here again, there's a high chance that the uprising will fail, like happened in Syria during the Arab Spring. And but still people do that because they hope they can provide other people with a better future, a democratic future, or a life with higher well-being. And in such situations, people really do not have a good options available. So neither the option of staying in the status quo nor the option of taking a risk are really desirable or not good options. So if they choose the status quo, they have to accept a very low level of well-being in the future. If they choose the risky option, there's a really high risk of failure and chance of success as well, but the outcomes could be very widely spread. And on the slide, you see an example of such a risk-taking situation. The kind of cases that I'm interested in, you see the status quo. There is, however things turn out, there will be a low level of well-being. If we take the risky choice, there might be good or a very bad outcome. And so the kind of cases that I'm interested in have been described by Madeleine Heijenhelm as risks taken from vulnerability. And she says that one characteristic of such risk-taking is that people sometimes choose an option that is riskier, even though it has lower expected utility. And Heijenhelm herself is just concerned with self-regarding risk-taking, so where people take risks for themselves. And she's also just interested in the descriptive and not the normative side. But her work kind of made me interested in the question, is such risk-taking actually permissible when we take risks for others? So the research question that I have is, when choosing for another person, is it ever permissible to choose the risk of 2 or more options, even if this option does not maximize the expected utility of the affected individual, or to put it more drastically, if it has less expected utility, as is the case in our example. And this question has been answered negatively in the literature, as far as I'm aware. So there seems to be a consensus that such kind of risk-taking is not permissible. And in my talk, I want to explore whether we can actually defend risk-taking, and I propose some possible defenses. Okay. So before moving to the defenses, I just want to say something in brief on risk inclination itself and other regarding choices. So for a long time, it has been assumed that rational individuals tend to maximize expected utility. So rational decision makers, their choice will be determined by the utility of possible outcomes and the probabilities of those outcomes. But in recent work in normative decision theory, some proposals have been made that actually rational decision makers do not only choose on the basis of utility and probability functions, but also on the basis of some risk function. So also their attitude to risk itself matters. And so it matters how she weighs probabilities. There are two ways of thinking about attitudes to risk itself. So Richard Bradley and Ori Stephenson, they suggest that agents actually can value probabilities as well and not only outcomes. So the decision weights are, in their theory, reflect the desirability of chances. And then on another interpretation of what attitudes to risk itself are, Laura Buchek suggests that attitudes to risk reflect how agents evaluate global properties of the option. So they look at the minimum and the maximum, they look at how widely the outcomes are spread, and then they choose a strategy which they think is the best way to pursue their ultimate ends. So on her view, chances don't have intrinsic value, but they contribute to the instrumental value of the gamble. What then is risk inclination? So I will talk a lot about risk inclination in this talk. So as I understand it, risk-inclined agent prefers out of two options with same average value or with equal expected value, the one in which outcomes are more spread, so where there's a higher maximum and lower minimum. And on these theories, we can explain risk inclination by two factors. So it could be explained by an agent's utility function, or it could be explained by the decision weights, so how they weigh the probabilities for outcomes. And we can say that there are many different reasonable risk attitudes, just as there are many reasonable utility functions that an agent could choose. Okay, so then let's also look at risk inclination in other regarding choices. So I want to stipulate in my example that the decision maker actually knows the utilities and the probabilities of the outcome. So the decision maker knows how the affected individual values the outcomes, and the decision maker also knows the probabilities of these outcomes. What she doesn't know is how the individual weighs the probabilities, so what the individual's attitude to risk is. So in the talk, when I talk about risk inclination, I mean actually that the risk-inclined agent is an agent who chooses among two options with equal average utility, the option in which outcomes are more spread out. So here I focus on equal expected utility rather than equal expected value, just because we already know the utility of the outcomes. And because my question is it permissible to choose an option that does not maximize expected utility? And then so if we put it that way, then we have two strategies to defend risk-inclined choices. So we either can say that certain outcomes have special moral weight or special moral value, or we can defend a special decision weight that the decision maker should take. And then finally, what I want to say, an important difference between choosing for others and choosing for oneself is obviously that when we choose for ourselves, we do not necessarily have to give a justification why we do choose one option rather than the other. So it's up to us what utilities we assign, it's up to us what decision weights we assign. But when we choose for other, we obviously have to justify that to the affected individual. So I want to say that the most important desideratum for an acceptable defense of risk inclination and other regarding choices is that the decision maker's choice must be acceptable to the affected individual. And that is regardless of where the individual ends up, so regardless of how the gamble turns out, and regardless of what the affected individual's actual attitude to risk is. So either way, it has to, the choice has to be defensible to the affected individual. Okay. So much about the preliminaries. Now we can look at the literature and what the literature has to say about cases like the one that I presented. So we can remember that that was our example case. We assumed probabilities and utilities were known. And then how should the decision maker choose for the affected individual? And one very common view is that the decision maker should maximize the expected utility of the affected individual. And there's a very simple justification for this view. So namely, it is based on the assumption that rational individuals maximize their own expected utility. So if I choose to maximize the expected utility for the affected individual, I'm actually doing what the individual herself would have done if she was rational. So, and even if things go wrong in that case, the choice is still justifiable because I can say this is actually the choice that the individual herself would have made. So expected utility maximization implicitly assumes that there are no decision weights, so probabilities are weighted linearly. And of course, if it is true that decision makers also, that rational decision makers actually can give different weights to probabilities, that this assumption needs defense. So we cannot simply assume that one should be risk neutral. Risk neutrality is just one among many different possible attitudes to risk. So this needs defense. And this is so, yeah. But anyway, as we see in the example case that we have the expected utility maximizer would choose the status quo because it has higher expected utility. Another view then is prioritarianism. Here the recommendation is that the decision maker should be risk averse. In our example, again, they should choose the status quo. And but they have different justifications. So they say that outcomes which are worse in utility have more weight. So we should, what the decision maker should do is they should choose the option that maximizes expected moral value, where the moral value is priority weighted utility. And again, we have an implicit assumption about risk neutrality. So, the decision maker should give no decision weights. There's one problem with prioritarianism, so it is very difficult to see or to explain why the decision maker should actually diverge from the valuation of outcomes that the affected individual herself has. So why do we value worse outcomes more than better outcomes if the individual herself does not do that? So that is very common critique of the prioritarian view. But importantly, my point here is just that this is just another view that says risk-inclined choices are not permissible. And finally, we have Laura Butchak's view. So she proposes, she's the defendant of a risk-weighted expected utility theory, and her recommendation is to choose the option that maximizes risk-weighted expected utility. And importantly, she says that when we choose for other individuals, we should defer to their valuation of outcomes, so we should use their utility function. And then there's one correct decision weight that we can choose, or one correct attitude to risk that we can choose, namely the most risk-averse attitude within reason. And again, this leads to a risk-averse choice. So again, the status quo should be chosen instead of the risky choice. So as far as I know, these are the dominant views in the literature, and I haven't seen any defense of risk-inclined choices yet. So what I want to do in the presentation is to make a case for permissible risk inclination in some cases.
Does Butchak mean the same thing as you by that risk variable R? Is that a measure of the spread of a random variable?
Sorry?
Is Butchak's R the same as what you had in mind for?
So that is the risk weighting function. So the weight she gives to the probabilities. So there's a function.
Does she have in mind the same thing that you described in terms of risk? I mean, as the meaning of risk, as a measure of the spread of a random variable's image.
Yeah, okay. That's how I understand it. Okay, so the first defense that I want to propose is the Sufficientarian defense of risk inclination. So that is actually the defense that I've been thinking about for the longest time, but I think I've come to the conclusion that it's quite difficult to defend. There are very many different versions of the doctrine of sufficiency, but they all share a very basic intuition. namely that it's extremely important to eliminate deprivation and to ensure that people have enough. And a strong version of sufficientarianism holds that benefits that lift individuals above the threshold are morally matter morally more than equally large benefits that don't. So we might assume that the individual here only in the outcome where she has a utility of 8 is above the threshold. So we should give more moral weight to that outcome, whereas all other outcomes where the individual is not lifted above the morally relevant threshold, they have the same weight. They don't get extra weight. So one might wonder where the threshold is, and there are different proposals. So it might be the point where compassion enters, might be freedom from duress, or the basic rights threshold, and as Yitzhak Ben-Bachi suggests, a threshold of personhood, pain, and luxury. So he has 3 thresholds. And of course, this view has then implications for other regarding choices where we choose for another individual. The strong version of sufficientarianism suggests that decision makers should weigh those outcomes in which the individual is brought across the threshold more, so they get more weight. And from that, we can get the following decision rules. So the decision maker should maximize expected moral value, where moral value is sufficiently weighted utility. And so we can assume, depending on the weight that we give to threshold crossing outcomes, that our risky choice then turns out to be actually the one that maximizes expected moral value. So that is roughly the idea. But there are difficulties with that defense of risk inclination. And the first is that it's only the strong version of sufficientarianism that actually supports those risk-inclined choices. But then this strong version of sufficientarianism actually finds very little support in the literature. And the second problem is that I think we have reasons to doubt that the decision rule would be acceptable to the affected individual. So something on the first point. So not all versions of sufficientarianism support risky choices. And so it's only the strong version that supports the idea that we should give more weight to threshold crossing outcomes. But there's basically only one formulation or one proponent of that view, and that is Harry Frankfurt. So he was the first one to articulate that view. And since then, a lot of people have offered more sophisticated versions, which are weaker versions of sufficientarianism. And basically everyone now subscribes to one or another weaker version of that view. The weaker versions, they accept the importance of thresholds. So they say there is something morally relevant about thresholds, but then they often say that benefits below the threshold they should be given more weight, but they should be given prioritarian weight. So the further below the threshold you are, the more important it is that we give benefits to you, and the closer you come to the threshold, the less important it gets to give you benefits. And then once we cross the threshold, the weighting. So we don't give any extra weights to benefits above the threshold, or we change the kind of weighting from a prioritarian to an egalitarian. So, and this weaker version accommodates intuitions much better, people say, than the strong version. For example, it is very intuitive that when we have one benefit to distribute, we could give that either to a person who is just shortly below the threshold, or to a person who is very badly off and very far from the threshold. Strong sufficientarianism would say we should give it to the person who's just below the threshold if it makes her cross the threshold, whereas weaker versions would say we should give it to the person who's very badly off. And a lot of people think that it's, especially when the threshold is quite high, it doesn't make so much, it seems more plausible to give it to persons who are much worse off. So that is one reason why people have objected to the strong version of sufficientarianism. But if we don't endorse the strong version, then we basically don't get a defense of risk inclination. So that is one problem. But the second problem then is that it's questionable whether this defense of risk inclination actually meets our desideratum. So whether it would be an acceptable decision rule for the affected individual. Because again, like with prioritarianism, we have the problem that we have to justify to the individual why we don't choose her own valuation of outcomes. And we have to explain why we don't use her utility assignments. And there might be different ways to try and justify that. So what clearly doesn't work, I think, is that the decision maker may just use their own subjective valuation of the outcomes. So that seems not right. But then one might think maybe there's some impersonal value impersonal value to threshold crossing outcomes. But again, there doesn't seem to be a very plausible candidate. So impersonal values are, for example, natural beauty, artistic value, or equality, but none of them seems to play a role in cases where we choose just for one individual and only her well-being is affected. And then, so an argument that Michael Otsuka has made in the case of prioritarian weighting in intrapersonal trade-offs is that it also seems somewhat misguided to look for an impersonal value in those cases, because the reason why we wanted to have Sufficientarianism, or in his case, prioritarianism in the first place, was that we are concerned with the individual and not with some impersonal value. So we wanted to do what is good for her. And then, so impersonal value, again, doesn't work to defend or to defend it to the affected individual. Then there is one solution that has been suggested by Lasse Nielsen. He says that, well, maybe it's not subjective personal value, so maybe we don't see it in the utility function, but definitely threshold crossing outcome or crossing threshold is important, and it has something what he calls objective personal value. And for him, so he sets the threshold at a level where people enjoy autonomy. And he writes about objective personal value that reaching a level at which a person is autonomous is valuable for this person, not only because of the utility he gets from being autonomous, but because this threshold carries the freedom to choose between options that he himself has reason to value. But I think that this proposal actually, so it either leads to double counting or to a paternalistic choice. So it seems as long as the individual values autonomy, this value will be captured in the utility she assigns to the outcome. And it's not clear to me what value of autonomy an individual could fail to capture if she values autonomy. So it seems perfectly plausible that if I value autonomy, I value my freedom and I value the opportunity this outcome affords me. So if people already value autonomy, there's no reason to give extra weight to those outcomes. If the individual does not adequately value autonomy, one might think that the decision maker may correct for that inadequate valuing. So she might give extra weight to outcomes. But in that case, it seems that there would be a complaint about the paternalism of such a choice. So why does the decision maker override my decision? Why is it not up to me to give little importance to autonomy? So it seems that even this objective personal value does not make the choice or the divergence from the utility of the affected individual acceptable to the affected individual. So this then concludes my discussion of the Sufficientarian defense for risk inclination. So I'm not optimistic that it will work. And I think that we are probably better off sticking to the utility that the individual himself assigns to the outcomes and look for another defense of risk inclination. And here is then another defense that I want to consider. So I propose the following decision rule. If you don't know someone's attitude to risk, choose as people like the affected individuals tend to choose. So you should refer to the relevant reference clause and be informed by their decision weights. And this decision rule, together with certain empirical findings about how groups tend to weight probabilities, then explains why risk inclination sometimes is permissible. And what I want to do in this section then is to defend the acceptability of this decision rule, and then also give some empirical evidence that we can actually correlate certain demographic data with attitudes to risk. So why should we think that this decision rule is acceptable to the affected individual. So what I do basically, or what I think, is that the decision maker who tries to approximate the individual's decision weight is actually showing respect to the affected individual. So they try to choose like the individual would actually choose, and that shows respect for the individual and her hypothetical choice. And because she doesn't know how the individual actually weighs probabilities, the best she can do is to look how people like the affected individual choose. So, and then even if the individual gets it, the decision maker gets it wrong and things turn out badly for the affected individual, it seems they have a good justification for their choice. So they can tell the individual, I was motivated to get it right for you. I was motivated to choose as you might have chosen. And I used the best evidence that I had available. But, sorry, it went wrong. So and this view is supported by an analogy, or I want to back it up by an analogy. So I think, so if you imagine that you have to buy a gift for a colleague at the department whom you hardly know, or maybe for a friend's child whom you also don't know, and you find yourself at a shop and bookshop or a department store choosing a gift. You don't know this person, and you also have no one to call and ask for more information what the individual looked like. So the best thing that you can probably do in that situation is to ask some shop assistant for help. And the shop assistant will probably ask you, so who are you looking, what kind of gift are you looking for, who is that person? And they might ask about the age or the sex of the person. And then they will tell you, well, women in that age, they in that age group, or academic women in that age group, they tend to like those kinds of books, and they recommend you a book. Or they say teenage boys of that age, at the moment they really like this computer game. So it seems that your chances of getting a gift that is appreciated is much better than randomly if you follow the advice of the shop assistant, and her advice is based on certain information about the relevant reference group. And of course, one might think that this is the wrong analogy. So choosing a gift is supererogatory. So if one doesn't get a gift, one doesn't have a complaint to start with. So even if it's a bad gift, there's nothing wrong. One has no reason to complain. But I think that even if we increase the stakes and think of other cases, I would maintain that the analogy holds. The more serious objection, though, is that utility and decision weights are not the same. So Lara Butchak in her article denies that they are the same, and so she actually explicitly denies this analogy that I draw. And she writes that different reasonable utility assignments are not on par in a way that different reasonable risk, or no, she says that different reasonable utility assignments are on par in a way that reasonable risk assignments are not. We default to risk avoidance, but there's nothing to single out any utility as default. And then, so in her text, she actually grants that if you have to pick a utility for a person where her utility is unknown, you might orient yourself towards the majority or people like the affected individual in order to pick. So if you don't know if they like chocolate or vanilla ice cream, you look at what the majority prefers and go in line with that. But you may not do that for decision attitudes to risk. And so that's the difference between my view and Butchak's view. So in my view, you should go along with the majority of the people who are like the affected individual. On her view, you should not do that. You should always take the most risk-avoidant attitude within reason. And she says that is the only attitude to risk that can be justified to everyone, regardless of what their attitude to risk turns out to be. Okay, but I don't think that her argument succeeds. And I don't think that she actually gives a good defense of risk-averse other regarding choices. So I want to look at her reasoning, and some slide you have a lengthy quote from her. So she says, justification is required when there's a discrepancy between how things turned out and how they could have turned out if a different choice were made. the required justification will be supplied by some advantage of the current choice in a different state. The size of that advantage in the other state as compared with the size of the disadvantage in the current state is relevant. And so too are the size of advantages and disadvantages in other possible states. But, and this is the crucial point, ending up in a relatively worse state requires stronger justification than ending up in a relatively better state. And further on, she says, some people might need less justification in worse states than the default requires in these states, but no one could reasonably need more. And just to understand her reasoning and see how it plays out, we can look at the following case. So imagine you are a doctor of a seriously ill and unconscious patients, and you have to choose between two possible treatments. Treatment X works for all patients, irrespective of their genetic disposition. The effectiveness of treatment Y depends on the genetic disposition of the patient. So for half of the population, it works very well. And for the other half of the population, it doesn't work so well. And there's no time to test which genetic disposition the individual has. So again, you have to be able to defend your choice as a doctor to the affected individual. And you need to, as Bujak puts it, you need to justify the discrepancy between the state the patient ends up in or the outcome where she ends up in to what she could have had a different choice been made. So if you pick treatment X and the individual ends up in state 2, there's a discrepancy of 3 with what you could have had you chosen treatment Y. And the same is true if you choose treatment Y and end up in state 1, then there's a disadvantage of 3 compared to the alternative choice. And so now you can justify the respective disadvantages by the advantage that the choice would have in a different state. So if you end up in choose treatment X and end up in state 2, you can justify the disadvantage by saying, well, this choice would have had an advantage in the other state. And what Bujak says then is that we should give more weight. So when we look at this, actually, it seems like the disadvantages and advantages are the same regardless. So they balance each other out regardless of which treatment you choose. But Bujak says that you should give more weight to worse outcomes, and because stronger justification is needed when you end up in a worse state. And I think we reach this conclusion only if we treat the complaints of risk-inclined and risk-averse individuals asymmetrically. So it seems she already built in the assumption that she actually needs to argue for in the end. So if we, so what she is saying is that we should choose treatment X because the advantage of 3 that we would get if we chose treatment Y, we would have an advantage of 3 in state 2, but this advantage would not be compensated by the disadvantage of 3 in state 1 because the worst state matters more. But it seems that exactly the same is true for the risk-inclined individual, which he is not looking at. So if you do as she suggests and you choose treatment X, and you end up in state 2, then it seems that the disadvantage of 3 will not be, for a risk-inclined individual, will not be compensated by the advantage of 3 in the worst state, because risk-inclined individuals, they care more about better states, so they care much more about ending up in better states than risk-averse individuals. So they would also have a complaint, and it seems that Lara Bujak treats those two cases asymmetrically. So she, right from the start, assumes that people always have a bigger complaint when they end up in worse states. But if we treat the cases symmetrically, it doesn't seem to be the case that we should be risk-averse. So I don't think that her reasoning actually supports the risk principle. I think it still seems to me that we should treat the cases asymmetrically, and that this then opens the door for this decision rule that I proposed. namely that we should choose as people like the affected individual tend to choose. Okay. So now that I've tried to explain why I think that this decision rule is acceptable to the affected individual, we can just briefly look at the empirical support. So it might be the case that we have this decision rule and it's acceptable to the affected individual, but still, if it's the case that risk attitudes are just randomly distributed in the population, or that there's in fact no group that is risk inclined, then it would be the decision rule would not support risk inclination. But there is some empirical evidence that certain groups tend to be more risk inclined. And so when we look at empirical findings, how people weigh probabilities, then Kahneman and Tversky, with their prospect theory, have provided a very, what is deemed to be a very good description of how people actually make decisions. And they say that people tend to overweigh small probabilities and underweigh large probabilities, both for gains and losses. And then, their studies actually show that there's an inflection point at roughly 0.3, a probability of 0.3. So up to that point, people overweigh probabilities, and after that, they underweigh probabilities, and that makes them, on average, risk averse. But recent studies have actually shown that actually there are not all people choose like American students, on which Kahneman and Tversky's results were based. But there are actually different demographic factors that correlate to the decision weights that people choose. So, and these are sex and height. They are found to be significant in studies, and so are income and national income. So one interesting finding in different studies is that people from poorer countries are actually more risk tolerant. So there's one study on Chinese, a comparison of Chinese study participants and Swiss study participants, and it was found that the Chinese, even though they both had this inverse S-shaped function over probabilities, Chinese participants were more risk tolerant, and in fact there was a significant minority that was risk inclined on average. And then we have several studies by Eider and his collaborators, and so he has found that there's indeed this negative correlation between national income and risk tolerance. So people in poorer countries are on average risk inclined, this is the conclusion. And then some weaker support, one might say, where it doesn't show that people are in fact risk inclined, but it still shows that people apparently are more risk tolerant than Kahneman and Tversky found in their studies. So there was a study with refugees in the Netherlands that showed that they in fact choose more like expected utility maximizers would. And the same finding for farmers in Uganda showed that they are risk neutral on average. So again, they act more like expected utility maximizers. Okay, and so here's just an illustration of the findings of Eider and Harridan. So for example, if we look at Nicaragua and Ethiopia, we see that the inflection point is much further to the right. So only at a probability of 0.6, they start underweighting probabilities, and they also distort probabilities much more. So they, Eider and Harridan, they say then that people are, on average, people in poorer countries tend to be risk inclined. So to conclude then the discussion of this decision rule, we can say that risk inclination is permissible whenever people like the affected individual tend to choose with risk inclination. And there's some empirical evidence that, in fact, there are certain groups that tend to choose with risk inclination. Okay, so now I want to turn to the last possible defense of risk inclination, which I call the prerogative to hope. In the two previous defenses, I have argued that the decision maker is required or should focus very much on the affected individual and be guided in her choice by what is good for the individual or what the individual would have chosen. So they were very much focused on the affected individual. However, in morality, there's actually room for people to, within certain limits, pursue their own agent relative reasons. rather than choosing what is agent neutrally best, or rather than being only concerned with the best for other people. So what I want to suggest is that the permissibility of risk inclination can actually sometimes be explained by such an agent-relative prerogative. And the decision rule here would then be, if you don't know someone's decision weight, you have an agent-relative prerogative to weight probabilities, provided the reasons for your choice of decision weight are acceptable to the affected individual. Okay. So first just maybe some words on agent-relative prerogatives and their limits. So as I said, an agent-relative prerogative is a permission to give somewhat more weight to one's own reasons or to one's own well-being when making choices. And there are certain limits to using one's prerogative or to acting on agent-relative reasons. So for example, one limitation is that I'm not allowed to give indefinite more weight to my own reasons, but just within certain limits, I'm allowed to weigh my own reasons more. And also, it seems I'm not allowed to act on bad agent-relative reasons. So for example, if I have the choice between either saving my own child or from breaking one leg and another person from breaking two legs, I have an agent-relative prerogative to save my own child from a minor harm that is lesser than that of harm to a stranger. But if my reason for saving a girl from a broken leg, rather than saving a boy from having two legs broken, is that I simply hate boys and made it my life project to let them suffer whenever possible, that seems a very bad reason, and then I don't have this prerogative, or then my reasons don't grant me a prerogative that I can act on. So, and I think something similar is true when we speak of agent-relative prerogatives in this context here. So I want to say that we have an agent-relative prerogative to be risk-inclined. Sometimes, so I want to say that so this prerogative cannot be based on bad reasons, and I will say a bit more about that later. And the other limitation to acting on such a prerogative is again that I might not give undue weight to my own reasons. So, for example, I think that if the decision weight of the affected individual was known, then maybe my agent-relative reasons for choosing my own decision weight would not outweigh the reasons to follow or to defer to the affected individual's decision weight. But since in our case the decision weights are unknown, I think it's not very controversial to say that the decision maker has a prerogative to act on her own reasons. So, and what I want to suggest is actually that a possible reason why a decision maker might want to insist on her prerogative to choose a particular decision weight is that the decision maker is hopeful or hopes for the best of the affected individual. And so there are two claims. One claim is that hope actually leads to risk-inclined decision weights, and the other claim is that acting on hope is acceptable to the affected individual. And I just briefly want to defend both those claims. So first, I want to say something about the claim that hope leads to risk inclination. And I think when one reads the literature on hope, there is some evidence that this is in fact the case, that having a hopeful attitude means overweighting probability. So I started to explore this idea because in the text of Madeleine Heinhelm on risk-taking in situations of vulnerability, she says that maybe one explanation why people tend to take those risks, even though they do not maximize expected utility and even though the option is riskier, is that they hope for the best. And so her claim is again that, so it's a more descriptive claim, and she also thinks just about self-regarding choices, but I think we can turn it actually into a normative argument concerning other regarding choices. And then when we look at the literature on hope, there's, for example, Bovens, who says that hope counteracts risk aversion. So when people are hopeful, it helps them to overcome their fixation on possible losses. And he thinks that hope and fear in conjunction actually help people to pursue a winning strategy in their life. So, and to maximize the payoffs in their life. So, and one can then assume if one is hopeful, but this hope is not balanced by fear, then probably one tends more towards a risk-inclined choice, whereas if fear overweighs hope, then one tends more towards a risk-averse choice. And if they're in the right balance, Luke Bowen suggests one probably comes to utility, expected utility maximizing. And so further support for this idea we find in Philip Pettit. So he actually builds in the overweighting of probabilities for better outcomes into the definition of hope. He writes that hope will consist in acting as if a desired prospect is going to obtain or has a good chance of obtaining. So on Pettit's account, the subjective probability a decision maker assigns to a desired outcome need not be in line with the probability on the basis of which she acts. So these two can come apart, and the latter he calls as if probability. So hopeful decision makers, they act as if the probability was higher. And then we find further support for that idea in an article of Miriam Schleifer-McCormick. And she writes that while hoping does not require that one believes the outcome is more likely than it is, it does often require that one treat the outcome more likely than it is. So again, we have this idea that an agent believes there's a certain probability, but if she's hopeful, then she will act as if the probability was actually higher. So that is some evidence from the literature on hope, on the relation between hope and risk-inclined choices, or risk-inclined attitude to risk itself. And I think, so this combined with the idea that hope is actually an acceptable reason to act, an acceptable reason to the affected individual, then would give us a defense of risk inclination. And so again, as I said, not any agent-relative reason will ground a prerogative. So we might think that immoral or malevolent reasons do not ground a prerogative. So, for example, if I'm risk-inclined in my choice for another individual simply because I love the thrill, or because I'm not concerned about the individual at all, so I don't care about the minimum possible outcomes, that seems to be a pretty bad reason for my choice, and it seems that the affected individual could rightly complain about a choice that is made on the basis of such reasons. So I don't think those kind of reasons give me a prerogative. But then it seems hope and fear are actually good reasons that the individual can accept, because hoping and fearing for another person's well-being are constitutive of caring and showing concern for that person. So, and again, so I take this from Luke Bobbins again, who argues that hoping actually is constitutive of love. So he has this maybe narrower idea that it's relevant to love, but I think we can generalize this and say that actually hoping for someone means to care about that person. So, for example, I can hope for people and thereby show my concern if I don't know them. So, for example, when a gold mine collapsed in China, and I heard on the news that there are miners trapped, and there's now this rescue mission on the way to save them, I was hoping that they would get out, and I was imagining how they would be saved and come back to their families. And I would say, so I think that I can hope in those situations, even though I don't love those persons, but I clearly, by hoping for their best, I show my concern and care for them. And then furthermore, I think that this close connection between hoping and caring for someone is already implied by the definition of hope. So almost everyone agrees that one necessary element of hope is that one desires a certain outcome. So one desires the outcome one is hoping for. So when I'm hoping that things turn out well for another person, I'm basically hoping and showing my concern for them because I hope things go well for them. So, and that then seems a good way to defend my choice. If I say I overweighted probabilities because I was hopeful, what I'm basically doing is that I'm thereby expressing my concern for the affected individual. And even if things go wrong, and even if the affected individual actually turns out to have a different attitude to risk, so even if she turns out to be risk averse, it seems when I say I was hoping for your best, and my hope was an expression for my concern for you. That seems like an acceptable reason for her. So I do think that this defense of risk inclination meets the desideratum. Okay, to sum up then, I suggested that hoping for the individual's best is an acceptable reason for overweighting probabilities of better outcomes. And I think therefore the decision maker who hopes has a prerogative to choose with risk inclination. Okay, so that then brings me to the end. If I have another minute, I just want to sum up. So I started my talk with two examples that got me interested in risk inclination in the cases where people take risks in a vulnerable situation where all options are bad. And now, in summing up, I just want to briefly say a bit more about work more on that. And we can see how all of the defenses that I offered actually give us some reason to think that choosing with risk inclination is particularly permissible, or might be more permissible in situations of vulnerability. So there's first the Sufficientarian defense, where I said I'm skeptical that it will work. On this view, it is permissible to choose the riskier of two options, even if that option has lower expected utility, if the affected individual does not appropriately value outcomes above the threshold. So that was the only situation where I said that maybe here we could make a plausible case for the Sufficientarian defense. And so if the Sufficientarian defense turns out to be right, and I had some doubts about that, then it seems we have a good explanation why risk-taking in vulnerable situations is permissible, because Sufficientarians, they are particularly concerned with people who are below a threshold, which tend to be people in a vulnerable situation. Then on my second defense, I said that choosing the risky option is permissible if individuals like the affected individual tend to choose with risk inclination. And again, there was some empirical evidence that suggested that in particularly poor people seem to choose more with risk inclination. So again, we have some evidence that maybe if we choose for people in a vulnerable situation, risk inclination might be more permissible than when we choose for American students or students from the affluent West. And then finally, the prerogative to hope. Here, risk inclination is permissible when the decision maker is hopeful. And so here I basically lack the empirical evidence to say that hope and fear are more common in situations of vulnerability, even though one might think that since so much is at stake in those kind of situations, hope and fear might be more pronounced than when not so much is at stake. Okay, and so that was all, and I thank you for your attention.